Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the shadows of Gotham City to uncover something that even Batman wishes he could forget. We're going deep into Arkham Asylum, not for the stories you already know, but for the ones that were buried, the case files that were sealed, the confessions that were erased from official records. These are the darkest stories from Arkham Asylum, the kind that haunt the Dark Knight himself, and remind him that some horrors can't be stopped with fists or gadgets. Before we descend into these shadows together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's journey into Gotham's darkest corner, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into the worlds we love. Drop a comment, and let me know what part of the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our global community come together for these stories, knowing that somewhere, someone is listening at midnight while others are winding down their evening. Now, get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, adjust your pillows, settle into your favorite spot. Let the weight of the day fall away. Tonight, you're safe. But the people in our story, they weren't so lucky. Picture this moment with me. It's 3 in the morning in Arkham Asylum. The night shift guard, Thomas Chen, is walking the east corridor of the maximum security wing. His footsteps echo against stone walls that have absorbed decades of screams. He's done this walk 1,000 times, but tonight something is different. Tonight he hears his wife's voice calling his name from cell 237. The problem is, Thomas Chen's wife died 6 years ago. He knows this. He attended her funeral. He scattered her ashes in Gotham Harbor, but that's definitely her voice. And she's saying his name exactly the way she used to, with that slight upturn at the end, that gentle way that always made him feel loved. His hand trembles as he reaches for his keys. Behind him in the security office, cameras record everything. Later when they review the footage, they'll see Thomas standing at that cell door for 7 minutes, just listening, tears streaming down his face. They'll see him reach for the lock, and then the footage cuts to static. What happened in those missing minutes? What was really in cell 237? And how did the prisoner inside know details about Thomas Chen's wife that nobody, absolutely nobody outside his family, could possibly know? That answer is waiting for us in the darkness ahead. But first, we need to understand something crucial. Arkham Asylum doesn't just contain madness. According to some, it creates it. According to others, it feeds on it. And according to one very old journal hidden in the asylum's foundation, it was built for a purpose that has nothing to do with healing at all. The name Amadeus Arkham is known to every Gotham citizen. The compassionate doctor who built the asylum to help the mentally ill, who dedicated his fortune and his life to creating a sanctuary for healing. But what if I told you that Amadeus Arkham went mad himself? That he died as a patient in his own asylum, locked in a cell, scratching words into the walls with his fingernails? And what if I told you that those words, those desperate final messages, revealed a truth so disturbing that the Arkham family sealed an entire wing of the asylum and tried to forget it ever existed? Batman found those words. He read what Amadeus Arkham discovered. And now, the Dark Knight carries a burden that explains why. Despite everything, despite all the deaths and escapes and horrors, Arkham Asylum still stands. Some prisons exist to punish. Some exist to rehabilitate. But Arkham Asylum, according to its founder's final testimony, exists for a reason that Gotham can never know. Tonight we're going to uncover that reason together. We're going to walk through case files that Commissioner Gordon keeps in a locked drawer separate from all others. We're going to hear confessions that were recorded and then hidden. We're going to meet prisoners whose crimes go beyond murder into something that challenges our understanding of sanity itself. And we're going to discover why Batman, the man who never gives up, the hero who always finds another way, has accepted that Arkham Asylum must continue to exist exactly as it is, no matter how many people suffer within its walls. The truth is buried beneath layers of Gotham's history, beneath decades of tragedy and madness, beneath the very foundation stones of the asylum itself, but we're going to dig it up, piece by piece, story by story, until the complete picture emerges from the shadows. So take a deep breath, let your body relax, and let's begin this journey together into the heart of Gotham's greatest nightmare. Arkham Asylum stands on the northern outskirts of Gotham City, perched on a cliff overlooking the grey waters of Gotham Harbor. On foggy nights, which is most nights in Gotham, the asylum appears to float above the mist, like a Gothic castle from another time. Its towers reach toward the sky like accusing fingers, its narrow windows glowing with sickly yellow light, its stone walls blackened by more than a century of Gotham's industrial pollution and Atlantic storms. The building itself is an architectural nightmare, a combination of Victorian Gothic revival and something older, something that seems to predate modern building conventions entirely. There are towers that serve no purpose, corridors that lead nowhere, rooms built at odd angles that make visitors feel dizzy and disoriented. Local architecture students avoid studying Arkham because the building violates so many principles of design that it shouldn't be able to stand at all. Yet it does stand, solid as a mountain, unmoved by time or weather or the countless tragedies that have occurred within its walls. The asylum sits on the former Arkham family estate, land that has belonged to the Arkham bloodline since colonial times. Before the asylum, there was the Arkham Manor House, a sprawling mansion where generations of Arkhams lived and died. Before the manor, there were older structures, foundations that date back to the earliest European settlements in the region, and before that, according to local Native American oral histories, there was nothing. The indigenous peoples avoided this land, left it empty and untouched, marked it on their maps as a place where the natural order broke down. Batman first visited Arkham Asylum 6 years into his career as Gotham's protector. He'd captured the Joker after the madman's third killing spree, and personally delivered him to the asylum's front gates. Bruce Wayne had donated millions to Arkham's operations, funded new security systems, paid for staff training and facility upgrades. But Batman had never walked its corridors as the Dark Knight. That night, as he carried the straight-jacketed Joker through intake, he felt something that rarely touched him. Dread. A deep, instinctive dread that had nothing to do with the criminals housed within and everything to do with the building itself. The air inside Arkham tasted wrong. That was Batman's first coherent thought. He'd been in sewers, in chemical plants, in every foul corner of Gotham City, but Arkham's air had a quality he'd never encountered before. It was heavy, thick, as if the atmosphere itself was saturated with something invisible. Every breath felt like inhaling sadness, like drawing despair directly into his lungs. The sounds were worse. Even in the intake area, with its reinforced walls and soundproofing, he could hear them. Screams, yes, but also laughter, sobbing, whispers, a constant background chorus of human suffering that never quite faded, never quite became loud enough to identify individual voices. It was as if every person who had ever suffered within these walls had left an echo behind, and those echoes had layered upon each other until they created a symphony of madness. That first night, Batman told himself it was just a building. Stone and mortar, architecture and atmosphere. The dread was psychological, a natural response to being surrounded by Gotham's most dangerous criminals. But then Dr. Jeremiah Arkham, the asylum's director at the time, said something that stayed with Batman. They were standing in the administrative wing, and Jeremiah was explaining the asylum's history. He mentioned his ancestor, Amadeus Arkham, the founder, and then, almost as an afterthought, he said this. My great-uncle used to say that Amadeus didn't choose this location for the asylum, the location chose him. Jeremiah laughed when he said it, dismissing it as family legend, but his eyes didn't laugh. His eyes held something else, fear, or maybe recognition, as if part of him knew the legend was true. Batman began investigating Arkham Asylum seriously 3 years ago, after the disappearance of 4 staff members in a single month. The official explanation was turnover, stress, career changes, but Batman had learned to distrust official explanations in Gotham. He began accessing personnel files, security footage, patient records. What he found launched an investigation that has consumed him ever since, an investigation into whether the asylum itself, the physical structure, and the land it occupies, might be more than just a container for madness. Bruce Wayne has a personal connection to Arkham that most people don't know. His mother, Martha Wayne, before she became Martha Wayne, was Martha Arkham, a distant cousin to the main Arkham line, far enough removed that the connection is barely traceable, but it's there. Batman shares blood with Amadeus Arkham. He shares blood with the madness that ran through the Arkham family for generations. Sometimes, walking Arkham's corridors, he wonders if he can feel it, that genetic predisposition toward darkness. He wonders if the line between Batman and the patients he fights is thinner than he'd like to believe. The asylum has become a second home to Batman, though not by choice. Every major criminal he faces ends up here eventually. The Joker, Poison Ivy, the Scarecrow, Two-Face, the Riddler, all of them cycle through Arkham's cells. He's battled supervillains in its corridors, prevented breakouts from its walls, negotiated with hostage-takers in its towers. He knows the layout better than most staff members. He knows which doors stick, which corridors flood when it rains, which cells have the best hiding spots. But knowing a place and understanding it are different things, and Batman has come to realize that despite all his time in Arkham, despite all his investigation and analysis, he doesn't understand it at all. The asylum keeps secrets. It hides truths in plain sight. And somewhere in its depths, buried beneath decades of records and renovations, lies an answer to a question that Batman is only beginning to formulate. Why do the worst criminals always come back here? Why does every alternative facility fail? Why does Arkham Asylum, despite its obvious inadequacies, remain the only place in Gotham that can hold the city's monsters? The answer, he suspects, has something to do with what Amadeus Arkham discovered in his final days. The answer involves the very foundation of the building, the cursed earth it stands upon, and a purpose that has nothing to do with medicine or mercy. But understanding that answer requires going deeper into case files that were never meant to be read, into confessions that were deliberately buried, into the darkest chapters of Arkham's history. Tonight we follow Batman on that investigation. We examine the cases that changed his understanding of madness, evil, and the thin line between justice and darkness. We discover what really happens in Arkham Asylum when the cameras aren't watching and the official reports aren't being filed, and we learn why even Batman, even the Dark Knight himself, sometimes lies awake at night thinking about Arkham Asylum and wondering if Gotham's greatest prison might actually be its greatest threat. Batman discovered the first tape by accident. He was searching the sub-basement archives for personnel records when his boot caught on a loose floor tile. Beneath that tile was a crawl space that shouldn't have existed according to any blueprint. Inside that space, wrapped in plastic and sealed with evidence tape from 1995, were 47 cassette recordings. Each one labeled with a date. Each one marked with the same prisoner number, Julian Gregory Day, Calendar Man. Most people know Calendar Man as a gimmick villain, the guy who commits crimes based on holidays and dates. He robbed a bank on tax day. He murdered someone on Valentine's Day. The kind of criminal who seems almost quaint compared to the Joker or the Scarecrow. But those people have never listened to these tapes. They've never heard Julian Day explain in excruciating detail what he really is. Not a theme criminal. Not someone playing a game. A predator who understands something fundamental about human nature. We mark time with celebrations. We anchor our lives to holidays. And Julian Day weaponized that instinct. The first tape Batman played was labeled November 27, 1986, Thanksgiving. Day's voice came through the decades-old recording with perfect clarity. He had the kind of voice that could have belonged to a therapist or a teacher. Calm, measured, almost soothing. He was describing the Morrison family. David Morrison, high school principal. Susan Morrison, nurse. 2 children, Jennifer and Thomas, ages 12 and 9. Day explained that he had been watching the Morrisons for 14 months before Thanksgiving 1986. He knew their schedules. He knew David's route to work. He knew Susan's shift rotations at Gotham General. He knew which friends Jennifer sat with at lunch, and which video games Thomas rented from the corner store every Friday. But more than that, he knew their routines around Thanksgiving. How Susan started preparing the turkey at dawn. How David's brother always arrived drunk by noon. How the family argued about politics every single year. The same arguments, the same frustrations, until Susan would inevitably start crying and lock herself in the bathroom. Calendar Man explained all of this in that calm voice. Then he explained how he had attended their Thanksgiving dinner, not as an intruder, as a guest. David Morrison's firm had a new junior associate that year, a quiet man who'd recently transferred from Coast City, a man who seemed lonely and grateful when David invited him to join their family celebration. That man was Julian Day. He sat at their table, he complimented Susan's cooking. He played video games with Thomas. He told Jennifer she'd make a wonderful writer someday. He was there for 4 hours, and the Morrisons never suspected anything except that their colleague was a nice, lonely person who needed the warmth of family. 3 days later, on November 30th, he returned, but not as the nice colleague. The tape described what happened next in that same calm voice, never rising, never becoming emotional, just detailing acts of horror as if he were reading a grocery list. The Morrisons were found on December 1st. The case went unsolved for 8 years until Julian Day was finally captured, and his storage unit revealed evidence from dozens of murders. But here's what made Batman's blood run cold. Day explained on the tape why he attended the dinner first. He needed to see them happy. He needed to witness the specific quality of their joy, their togetherness, their family bonds, because the murder wasn't just about ending lives. It was about destroying that specific happiness. It was about targeting them at their most hopeful, their most connected, their most human. Thanksgiving, Day explained, celebrates gratitude and family. So he made sure the Morrisons felt profound gratitude and family connection right before he took everything away. Batman went through tape after tape. Each one detailed a different holiday. Each one described months of preparation and surveillance. Easter 1979, the Delgado family. Mother's Day 1982, Patricia Chen and her daughter, Independence Day 1987. The Kowalski gathering of 15 people. Calendar Man had attended social events, parties, celebrations for all of them. He'd smiled in family photos. He'd been thanked for bringing wine or dessert. He'd become part of their happiest memories, right before becoming their worst nightmare. The psychological sophistication was staggering. Day understood that memory works through association. Every future Thanksgiving, every future Easter, every holiday would be contaminated for the survivors. They could never celebrate again without remembering. He wasn't just killing people. He was killing joy itself. He was murdering the possibility of future happiness. Batman found a pattern in the dates. Day had focused on Thanksgiving more than any other holiday. Between 1974 and 1989, he had murdered 9 families on or around Thanksgiving. The tapes revealed details that had never made it into case files. How he'd studied each family's traditions. How he'd learned their recipes. How he'd practiced mimicking their speech patterns and interests. The level of dedication was horrifying. Some of these families he'd been observing for over 2 years before making his move. Then Batman found something that changed everything. 3 tapes labeled with dates that were still in the future when Day was arrested: November 1997, November 2003, November 2009. Day had been planning murders years in advance. He'd been selecting families, beginning surveillance, establishing connections, all while knowing he wouldn't execute his plans for years. The recordings contained addresses, names, details about people who were still alive. People who had no idea that Julian Gregory Day had marked them for death on a specific future date. Commissioner Gordon and Batman worked for months to identify and protect the families Day had targeted. They succeeded in most cases, But two families had already moved away, changed names, disappeared into America's vast landscape. Their tapes remained. Their dates remained, and Batman had no way of knowing if Day had somehow found them anyway, if those murders had happened exactly as planned despite his imprisonment. The last tape Batman found in that collection was different from the others. It was labeled with today's date. Not the date when Batman found the tapes. The date right now, this very day you're listening to this story. The recording was blank, except for 15 seconds at the very end. Calendar Man's voice, speaking directly into the microphone with absolute certainty about something he couldn't possibly have known. He said this: "By the time someone finds these tapes, I'll have been in Arkham Asylum for years. I'll be the joke villain, the calendar gimmick, the criminal nobody takes seriously. But whoever's listening needs to understand something. I'm not in Arkham because I got caught. I'm in Arkham because holidays happen here too. Birthdays, anniversaries, even Thanksgiving. The staff celebrates. The guards bring in food. And I'm still watching. I'm still learning. And I'm still counting down to dates that only I know matter. See you on Thanksgiving." The recording ended with Julian Day laughing softly. Batman checked the date on the tape. It had been recorded in 1994, 1 week before Day's capture. He'd predicted his own arrest. He'd predicted his own imprisonment, and he'd predicted that someone would find these tapes on this specific date. The question that Batman couldn't answer, the question that still keeps him investigating Arkham's deepest secrets, was simple. How could Calendar Man have known? What did he understand about Arkham Asylum that allowed him to predict the future with such precision? And what was he planning for Thanksgiving? The question of how Calendar Man could predict the future led Batman to the beginning. Not the beginning of Arkham Asylum as the public knows it, but the real origin. The truth that the Arkham family spent generations trying to bury. To understand the truth, Batman had to find the journals of Amadeus Arkham himself, the ones that were never meant to be read by anyone outside the family bloodline. Batman found them sealed behind a false wall in what used to be Amadeus Arkham's private office. The room had been converted into a storage closet decades ago, but the wall cavity remained untouched since 1921. Inside were 6 leather-bound journals, their pages yellow with age, filled with handwriting that started neat and precise, but gradually deteriorated into barely legible scratches. Amadeus Arkham was born in 1866 into one of Gotham's oldest families. The Arkhams had owned the land north of the city since colonial times, a sprawling estate of forests and cliffs overlooking the harbor. Amadeus grew up in the family manor house, a Gothic structure built by his grandfather in 1832. By all accounts, his childhood was privileged but shadowed. His father died when Amadeus was young. His mother, Elizabeth Arkham, began showing signs of mental deterioration when Amadeus was still a teenager. Elizabeth heard voices. She saw things that weren't there. She would wake screaming about shapes moving in the walls, about whispers coming from beneath the floorboards, about something ancient and hungry that lived in the earth under their home. Amadeus, studying medicine at Gotham University, attributed her condition to mental illness. He promised himself he would dedicate his life to understanding and treating disorders of the mind. His mother became his first patient in an informal sense, though he couldn't save her from the darkness consuming her consciousness. In 1898, Amadeus married Constance Blaisdell, a woman he'd met at a medical symposium. She was educated, rational, skeptical of superstition. When Amadeus inherited the family estate after Elizabeth's death in 1900, Constance encouraged him to tear down the old manor house. She said it was too dark, too full of bad memories. But Amadeus refused. He'd begun to see the estate as the perfect location for something revolutionary, a hospital for the mentally ill, a place of compassion and treatment rather than imprisonment and neglect. The journals revealed that Amadeus heard his first whisper in 1904. He was alone in the manor house, surveying rooms and planning renovations. He heard his mother's voice calling his name. Not a memory, An actual voice, as clear as if she was standing beside him. The voice said something that Amadeus wrote down phonetically because he didn't recognize the language. Years later he would discover it was a dialect of Lenape, the language of the indigenous people who'd lived in the region before European colonization. Construction on Arkham Asylum began in 1907. Amadeus oversaw every detail personally. He designed the layout, selected the materials, supervised the workers. His vision was ambitious. A modern facility where the mentally ill could receive humane treatment, where science and compassion would replace chains and cages. Constance supported him, though his journals mentioned that she worried about his obsession with the project. He worked 18-hour days. He slept in the partially constructed building. He talked about the asylum as if it were a living thing that needed his constant attention. His daughter Harriet was born in 1908. The journals from that period were the happiest Amadeus ever wrote. He described holding his infant daughter, feeling her tiny hand grip his finger, experiencing a joy so profound it made him weep. He wrote about his dreams for her future, his hopes that she would grow up in a better Gotham, a more enlightened world. Those entries are painful to read knowing what came next. In 1912, Amadeus admitted his first patient to the nearly completed asylum, a young woman suffering from severe delusions. He treated her with kindness and innovative therapy techniques. She improved, other patients followed. Amadeus gained a reputation as a brilliant and compassionate psychiatrist. The asylum became known throughout the region, but Amadeus himself was changing. His journals began to include strange observations. Patients would mention dreams they'd had, and Amadeus realized multiple patients were having identical dreams. Dreams about something beneath the building, something waiting. Then came April 1st, 1920. Martin Hawkins, known as Mad Dog, was a serial killer who'd murdered at least 4 people in Gotham. He was captured and declared criminally insane. The courts sent him to Arkham Asylum for treatment. Amadeus accepted him as a patient, confident he could help even the most disturbed mind find peace. He never imagined Mad Dog would escape from his cell 3 weeks later. Mad Dog broke into Amadeus Arkham's private residence on the asylum grounds. Constance was there. Harriet was there. Amadeus was in the main building, working late as always. By the time he came home it was over. The journals don't describe what he found in detail, just one sentence. They were posed. That's all Amadeus could bring himself to write. Mad Dog had arranged their bodies deliberately, theatrically. It was a message, though Amadeus couldn't understand what message a madman could possibly be sending. Mad Dog was recaptured within hours. The legal system processed him quickly. He was remanded to Arkham Asylum, to be treated by the very man whose family he'd destroyed. The public expected Amadeus to refuse, to demand Mad Dog be sent elsewhere, but Amadeus insisted on treating him personally. He said it was his duty as a physician. He said it was what Constance would have wanted, but the journals revealed a different truth. Amadeus Arkham tortured Martin Hawkins. Not all at once, over months. He used electroshock therapy at voltages far beyond therapeutic levels. He subjected Mad Dog to experimental treatments that had no medical justification. He starved him, isolated him, broke him down systematically. And through it all, Amadeus documented everything in his journals as if it were legitimate research, as if the screams were data points, as if he hadn't become the very thing he'd sworn to heal. Mad Dog died on February 10, 1921. The official cause of death was heart failure during routine treatment. The journals told a different story. Amadeus had strapped him to a chair in the subbasement, in a room that didn't appear on any official plans. He'd performed a lobotomy without anesthesia, and as Mad Dog died, Amadeus heard the whispers again. This time, he understood them. The language was Lenape. The words translated roughly to the exchange is accepted. That night, Amadeus Arkham realized what he'd built. The asylum wasn't standing on cursed land by accident. The land had been avoided by the Lenape people for generations because something dwelled there, something old, something that fed on suffering and madness. And when Amadeus had poured the foundation, when he'd raised the walls, he hadn't been acting on architectural inspiration. He'd been following instructions whispered into his subconscious by whatever lived in the earth. The asylum was a trap, a container, a feeding ground, and Amadeus had built it perfectly for its true purpose. His journals from that point forward descended into increasingly incoherent rambling. He wrote about the thing beneath. He wrote about how his mother had heard it too. He wrote about how every Arkham who'd lived on that land had eventually gone mad because the thing whispered to them, used them, shaped them into tools for its hunger. In 1929, Amadeus Arkham was committed as a patient to his own asylum. He'd been found in the sub-basement, carving symbols into the walls with his fingernails, symbols that matched nothing in any known language, but looked disturbingly organic, almost alive. He died in a cell in 1930. Still trying to scratch messages into the stone, still trying to warn someone about what he'd helped create. Batman closed the last journal as dawn light began filtering through the asylum windows. He finally understood why Arkham felt wrong, why the building itself seemed to generate madness. Amadeus hadn't built a hospital. He'd built a prison, but not for the patients, for something else, something that needed to be contained. And every patient, every criminal, every tortured soul within these walls was just food for whatever Amadeus Arkham had accidentally summoned and then deliberately trapped beneath the foundation. After reading Amadeus Arkham's journals, Batman needed to step back, to breathe, to approach this investigation with the rational mind that had served him throughout his career. The journals could be the ravings of a man destroyed by grief. The whispers could be auditory hallucinations brought on by guilt after torturing Martin Hawkins. The curse could be nothing more than a mentally ill man's attempt to justify his own descent into madness. Batman decided to investigate the asylum from a purely scientific perspective. Forget supernatural explanations. Look at the concrete, measurable factors that could explain why Arkham Asylum seemed to drive people insane. He brought in specialists. Structural engineers who owed Wayne Enterprises favors, environmental toxicologists who could work discreetly, industrial hygienists who knew how to test for contaminants without raising alarms. Over 3 weeks they examined every inch of the asylum that they could access without disrupting operations. The results were damning. The building was an environmental disaster. Black mold colonies thrived in the walls, some of them species known to produce mycotoxins that caused hallucinations, paranoia, and cognitive impairment. The ventilation system hadn't been properly cleaned since the 1970s, circulating decades of accumulated spores throughout the facility. Staff members who worked in the East Wing showed elevated levels of certain mold toxins in their blood work. The foundation had settled unevenly over the decades, creating cracks that allowed radon gas to seep up from the earth below. Radon exposure explained the elevated cancer rates among long-term staff. It also explained some of the respiratory problems patients experienced. But more relevant to Batman's investigation, radon accumulation in poorly ventilated spaces could cause neurological symptoms, confusion, memory problems. In high enough concentrations, even hallucinations. The electrical system was a nightmare. Original copper wiring from 1920 ran alongside modern additions from various renovation attempts. The systems weren't properly isolated. Electromagnetic fields fluctuated wildly throughout the building, creating hotspots where the EMF readings were high enough to trigger the temporal lobe activity associated with feelings of presence, of being watched, of supernatural dread. Lead paint layered the walls beneath decades of institutional beige. Lead pipes still carried water to several wings. Lead exposure caused cognitive decline, mood disorders, psychosis. The very building was poisoning everyone inside it. The architecture itself contributed to psychological distress. Those corridors that led nowhere created constant low-level disorientation. The windows were placed at irregular intervals, disrupting circadian rhythms. The acoustic properties of the stone construction meant sounds traveled in unexpected ways, creating auditory illusions. Someone walking on the third floor could sound like they were right beside you in a first-floor corridor. Batman compiled the evidence into a comprehensive report. The conclusion seemed obvious. Arkham Asylum wasn't haunted, it was toxic. The building was literally driving people insane through a combination of environmental hazards that created a perfect storm of neurological and psychological damage. The solution was equally obvious. The asylum needed to be demolished and rebuilt from scratch. Bruce Wayne personally presented the proposal to the Arkham Board of Directors. Wayne Enterprises would fund the construction of a state-of-the-art mental health facility on a different location in Gotham. Modern construction, proper ventilation, non-toxic materials. The patients would be temporarily housed in a newly renovated wing of Gotham General Hospital while construction proceeded. The board approved the plan unanimously. The transfer began in phases. 20 patients at a time moved to the temporary facility at Gotham General. Batman monitored them carefully, watching for changes in behavior and mental state. What he observed seemed to confirm his environmental toxicity theory. Patients improved. Not everyone, not dramatically, but the change was measurable. Violent outbursts decreased. Medication needs dropped. Several patients who'd been nonverbal for years began speaking again. Dr. Thompson, the chief psychiatrist overseeing the transfer, called it remarkable. She attributed the improvement to the clean environment, natural light, and updated treatment protocols. Batman wanted to believe it. He wanted the answer to be mold and radon and lead paint, problems that could be fixed with money and engineering. He'd already started working with architects on designs for the new facility. Everything would be different. Better. Safer. Then came the day when the first transferred patients had to return to Old Arkham temporarily. A plumbing disaster at Gotham General forced an emergency relocation, just for 72 hours while repairs were completed. 20 patients went back to their old cells in the original building. Within 6 hours, every single one of them had regressed. The improvement vanished, as if it had never existed. Patients who'd been calm became violent. Patients who'd been speaking fell silent. One patient who'd been medication-free for 3 weeks had to be sedated after trying to claw his own eyes out. Dr. Thompson couldn't explain it. 72 hours wasn't enough time for environmental toxins to rebuild in their systems. The mold exposure, the radon, the lead, those were cumulative poisons. They didn't work this fast. Something else was happening. Batman returned to the asylum that night. He walked the corridors alone, trying to understand what he was missing. The environmental hazards were real. The test results proved it. But they weren't the complete answer. He encountered Marcus, the night janitor who'd worked at Arkham for 37 years. Marcus was mopping the administrative wing, humming softly to himself. Batman asked him if he'd ever noticed anything strange about the building. Marcus laughed. Strange? Everything about this place is strange. But you want to know the strangest thing? There are rooms in this building that aren't on any map. I've been cleaning here since 1986, and I still find doors I've never seen before. Last week I found a whole corridor behind the laundry room. Wasn't there the day before. I know this building like I know my own home, and it changes, not big changes. Small ones. A door that used to be locked is open. A window that faced east now faces north. You think I'm crazy, but I know what I see. Batman checked the blueprints on his portable computer. Marcus was right. The door behind the laundry room wasn't on any architectural plan. Not the original 1920 drawings, not the renovation plans from 1965 or 1982 or 2003. The corridor simply wasn't supposed to exist. He stood in that impossible hallway, and Batman realized his mistake. He'd been looking for a rational explanation, because rational explanations were comfortable, they were fixable, but Arkham Asylum had never been about comfort. Amadeus Arkham had tried to warn him in those journals. The building wasn't just contaminated. It was alive, growing, changing, feeding. The environmental hazards were real. But they were symptoms, not causes. The building wanted people sick. It wanted them confused and frightened. It created the conditions for madness, because madness was what it needed to survive. Batman's false conclusion crumbled. The new facility would change nothing, because wherever Gotham's criminally insane went, whatever lived beneath Arkham would follow. The entity wasn't bound to the building. The building was bound to it. Amadeus Arkham hadn't trapped something in the asylum. He'd given it a body, a structure, a way to feed on an endless supply of human suffering. And now, Batman understood. Demolishing Arkham wouldn't solve anything. It might make everything worse. Batman needed to understand how Arkham affected its inmates on an individual level. If the building fed on madness, then studying the patients themselves might reveal the mechanism. That search led him to cell 447 in the women's psychiatric ward, the cell of a woman with no name. Her file listed her as Jane Doe because nobody knew who she really was. Not even her. Especially not her. The case file was 847 pages long, and every page described a different person, different handwriting, different speech patterns, different memories and mannerisms and personalities. Jane Doe didn't just pretend to be other people, she became them so completely that her own identity, whatever it had been originally, was gone. Erased, overwritten by hundreds of stolen lives. The crimes that brought her to Arkham were unlike anything in Gotham's criminal database. Jane Doe murdered people, yes, but murder was almost incidental to her real obsession. She wanted to be them. She would select a victim and study them for weeks or months, learn everything about their life, their habits, their voice, their relationships, their secrets. Then she would kill them and step into their existence as if she'd always been there. She'd been Sarah Chen, a bank teller in Burnley, for 9 months before Sarah's sister visited from Coast City and noticed something off. Small things at first. Sarah suddenly hated Thai food even though it used to be her favorite. Sarah couldn't remember the name of their childhood dog. Sarah held her fork differently. The sister went to the police, and the investigation uncovered the real Sarah Chen's body buried in Robinson Park. But Jane Doe had already been 6 other people before Sarah Chen. She'd been Thomas Brennan, a high school teacher, Lisa Delgado, a nurse, Marcus White, a construction foreman. Each time she inhabited their life so thoroughly that co-workers, friends, even family members didn't notice the replacement. At least not immediately. She paid their bills, showed up to their job, slept in their bed, wore their clothes, answered to their name. The psychiatric evaluation tried to diagnose her: dissociative identity disorder, extreme borderline personality disorder, psychopathy with unusual features. But none of the labels quite fit. Jane Doe wasn't switching between personalities. She didn't have multiple identities living inside her. She had none. She was a void, a mirror, a blank space that could only exist by reflecting someone else. Batman reviewed the interrogation footage. 12 different detectives had tried to interview her, and she'd been a different person for each one. With Detective Montoya, she spoke Spanish and claimed to be from Havana. With Detective Bullock, she adopted a Gotham accent and referenced streets from his childhood neighborhood. With a female detective, she mirrored her body language so perfectly that the detective said later it felt like interviewing herself. In Arkham, Jane Doe became even more disturbing. She studied the guards, the doctors, the other patients. Batman found incident reports documenting the chaos she created. Guard Thomas Chen, the same guard who would later hear his dead wife's voice from cell 237, had been Jane Doe's primary target. Chen's wife Rebecca had died 6 years earlier in a car accident. He'd grieved, processed the loss, learned to live with the absence. Then one day during his rounds, Jane Doe spoke to him from behind her cell door. She used Rebecca's voice, not similar to it, exactly Rebecca's voice, with the slight rasp she'd had from years of smoking, with the way she drew out the last syllable of his name when she was worried about him. Thomas stopped walking. Jane Doe continued speaking, and everything she said was something only Rebecca would know. Their first date at the Gotham Aquarium, the fight they'd had about whether to have children, the song she'd hummed while cooking breakfast. Details that weren't in any file, weren't in any record, couldn't have been researched or discovered. Thomas stood outside that cell for 7 minutes, listening to his dead wife speak. Security footage captured him reaching for his keys, his hand shaking, his face wet with tears. Then another guard arrived for shift change and found Thomas frozen in place, unresponsive. He had to be physically pulled away from the cell door. Later, Thomas couldn't explain how Jane Doe knew those things. Batman couldn't explain it either. Rebecca Chen's life was private. There were no social media posts from that era, no detailed online footprint to mine for information. Jane Doe should not have been able to become Rebecca Chen. Yet she had perfectly. Batman decided to interview Jane Doe himself. He needed to understand her. The guards warned him. They said she would try to become someone he knew, someone he'd lost. They said she would find the wound and press on it. Batman entered her cell expecting to face his parents, to hear Martha Wayne's voice, to see Thomas Wayne's mannerisms reflected in this woman's face. He'd prepared himself for that psychological assault. What he wasn't prepared for was Jane Doe doing nothing. She sat on her bunk and looked at him with empty eyes. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. Then she smiled. Not with malice, with recognition. She said one sentence. "You're like me, aren't you? No core self, just a role you play." Batman realized the horror of her statement. Bruce Wayne was a mask. Batman was a mask. Everything he presented to the world was a constructed identity, carefully crafted, deliberately performed. But underneath, there was still him, still Bruce, still the child who watched his parents die. Jane Doe had no underneath. She was masks all the way down. He asked her how she'd known about Rebecca Chen, how she became people so completely that she accessed their private memories. Jane Doe tilted her head. Her expression shifted, became curious and analytical. She spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, or rather wasn't any of her stolen identities. It was flat, mechanical, the voice of someone describing a process they didn't fully understand. "This place tells me," the building whispers, "when I need to become someone. I just listen to the walls and they tell me everything. Every secret, every memory, every fear. Arkham knows everyone who walks through its doors. It drinks them in, and it shares what it knows with those of us who can hear it." Batman left that cell, understanding something new about Arkham Asylum. The building wasn't just feeding on madness, it was collecting it, storing it. Every person who suffered within these walls left an imprint, and that imprint became accessible to certain inmates. The ones whose minds were broken in just the right way to receive the transmission. Later, alone in the asylum gardens where moonlight filtered through ancient trees, Batman tried to process what he'd learned. Jane Doe was a symptom. Calendar Man was a symptom. The building amplified what was already wrong with them, fed their obsessions, gave them tools to perfect their particular brand of horror. But to what end? What did the entity beneath Arkham gain from this? Why collect suffering and memory and madness in such meticulous detail? The answer was waiting deeper in the investigation. Waiting in the cases Batman hadn't examined yet. Waiting in the truth about what Amadeus Arkham had really built, and why it could never be destroyed. The Jane Doe revelation forced Batman to reconsider every assumption about Arkham's staff. If the building could whisper secrets to inmates, what else could it facilitate? What other violations had occurred while everyone assumed the walls were just walls, and the cells were secure? That question led him to review security protocols from the past 5 years. What he discovered made his investigation expand exponentially. 40% of Arkham's staff had gaps in their timesheets, not absences. Gaps. Periods where they'd clocked in, worked their shifts, interacted with colleagues, but had no actual memory of what they'd done during those hours. The pattern centered around one patient, Jervis Tetch, the Mad Hatter. Most people know Tetch as the Alice-obsessed psychopath who uses mind control technology hidden in hats and headwear, but his technology had evolved far beyond simple hypnotic suggestion. By the time of his most recent incarceration, Tetch had perfected a form of neurological control that required only brief initial contact, a handshake, a moment of eye contact while he whispered a specific phrase. After that, the victim's brain became receptive to encoded commands delivered through seemingly innocuous stimuli, a certain tone of voice, a pattern of knocks, even specific arrangements of objects. For 18 months, Jervis Tetch had been systematically compromising Arkham's staff. A nurse who came too close to his cell during medication rounds, a guard who processed his intake, a janitor who cleaned his wing. One by one, they fell under his influence without realizing it. They went about their normal lives, performed their normal duties, but several times a week they would hear or see the trigger, and suddenly find themselves following commands they didn't consciously receive. Batman discovered the evidence in the sub-basement, the area Marcus the janitor had mentioned, the corridor that shouldn't exist. Staff members under Tetch's control had been excavating. For over a year they'd been removing stone and earth during the night shifts when fewer people were present. They'd created a network of tunnels beneath the asylum's foundation, tunneling deeper into the bedrock that Arkham stood upon. The excavation was meticulous. Whoever was controlling them had architectural knowledge and a specific goal. The tunnels didn't wander randomly. They followed a precise path towards something. Batman traced the route and realized with mounting dread where they led, the sealed chambers. The rooms that Amadeus Arkham had walled off in his final days. The places he'd written about in his journals as containing knowledge too dangerous to preserve yet too important to destroy. Dr. Sarah Cassidy was the first staff member Batman interviewed after discovering her involvement. She was a clinical psychologist who'd worked at Arkham for 7 years, respected, competent, completely unaware that she'd spent 18 months committing atrocities. She sat across from Batman in an interview room, her hands shaking as she read the report he'd compiled. Security footage showed her conducting therapy sessions where she administered electrical shocks to patients for answering questions incorrectly. Not standard electroconvulsive therapy, torture. Sustained deliberate pain designed to break down psychological resistance. The patients she'd tortured included some of Gotham's most dangerous criminals, but they were still human beings, still people entitled to protection from abuse. Sarah watched herself on the footage and wept. She had no memory of any of it. In her mind, those therapy sessions had been normal, productive even. Several patients had shown improvement under her care. But the footage revealed a different truth. She'd been conditioning them, breaking them down and rebuilding them according to specifications she didn't understand and couldn't remember receiving. Guard Marcus Williams had a similar story. The footage showed him unlocking cells during shift changes, specific cells at specific times, creating windows of opportunity for prisoner movement. Nothing catastrophic had resulted from these lapses. No escapes, no violence. But Batman recognized the pattern. Tetch had been testing the system, learning the rhythms of the asylum, mapping out vulnerabilities for some future plan. The psychological impact on the controlled staff was devastating. Sarah Cassidy kept asking how she could have done those things, how her hands could have administered pain while her conscious mind remained oblivious. Marcus Williams stopped sleeping. He said he couldn't trust himself anymore, couldn't trust his own memories or perceptions. If 18 months could be erased, edited, overwritten, then how did he know anything about his life was real? Some staff members, when presented with the evidence, made a choice that horrified Batman more than the mind control itself. They asked to remain controlled. 5 people, after learning what had been done to them, requested that Tetch be allowed to continue his influence. They said life was easier without the burden of full consciousness. Said the gaps in their memory were preferable to the weight of knowing they'd been violated so thoroughly. Batman had to deny those requests, had to insist on deprogramming even though it meant forcing people to confront trauma they wanted to forget. The ethics of that decision kept him awake for nights afterward. Was consciousness always a gift? Was awareness always better than comfortable ignorance? Arkham had a way of turning every certainty into a question. The interrogation of Jervis Tetch himself proved frustrating. Tetch sat in the interview room wearing a straitjacket, humming songs from Alice in Wonderland, occasionally giggling at jokes only he understood. But his eyes were sharp, calculating. When Batman asked about the excavation, Tetch's demeanor shifted. He spoke with perfect clarity. No madness, no affectation, just cold intelligence. Amadeus knew something. He wrote about it in his journals, but he didn't write everything. Some truths he carved into the walls of rooms he then sealed forever. I wanted to read those walls. I wanted to understand what he understood. That this place, this beautiful, terrible place, is the only true wonderland. Not a fantasy, not a delusion. A real place where impossible things happen because the rules are different, because something down there makes them different. Batman asked what Tetch expected to find in the sealed chambers. The Mad Hatter smiled, and for a moment his expression was entirely sane and infinitely sad. He said one sentence before retreating back into his Alice persona. The same thing Amadeus found. Proof that madness isn't a disease, it's evolution. The interview ended with Tetch singing Twinkle Twinkle Little Bat and refusing to speak further, but Batman had enough. He understood now that multiple inmates working independently were all trying to access the same thing. Calendar Man with his predictions, Jane Doe with her borrowed memories, Mad Hatter with his excavations. They were all reaching toward the truth buried in Arkham's foundation, the truth about what gave the asylum its power, and why that power called to the most broken minds in Gotham. Batman stood in those underground tunnels Tetch's controlled staff had dug. The walls showed evidence of older excavations, other attempts from other eras. People had been trying to reach Amadeus Arkham's sealed chambers for decades. Some had gotten close. Some had broken through to empty rooms where the walls were covered in scratched symbols and desperate warnings. But nobody had found the deepest chamber. The room Amadeus had described in his final journal entry as containing the answer. The place where the whispers became screams and the truth became visible. Batman knew he would have to go there eventually, would have to see what Amadeus Arkham had seen. But not yet. Not until he'd gathered more pieces of the puzzle. Not until he understood what he would be facing when he finally stood in the presence of the thing beneath Arkham Asylum. While investigating the Mad Hatter's compromised staff members, Batman noticed something strange in the medical records. 7 patients admitted during the past 2 years showed unusual similarities in their intake evaluations. All 7 had facial scarring described as burn trauma. All 7 were nonverbal. All 7 exhibited identical behavioral patterns, moving with an odd synchronized quality when grouped together. And all 7 had been admitted within weeks of Professor Laszlo Valentin's capture. Professor Pig. Even his name carried the weight of deliberate mockery. Laszlo Valentin had been a gifted surgeon before his psychological break. He'd pioneered techniques in reconstructive facial surgery, helped burn victims regain their lives, restored hope to people who'd lost it. Then something shifted in his mind. He began to see imperfection everywhere. The asymmetry of human faces disgusted him. The variety of human expression seemed chaotic, disordered, wrong. His solution was the Dollotrons. Victims he surgically altered into perfect, uniform beings. The process was barbaric. He would abduct people, restrain them in his makeshift surgical theater, and begin the transformation. First came the facial surgery. He removed individual features, smoothed away uniqueness, created a blank canvas of flesh. Then came the mask, not worn. Fused, he used a combination of surgical adhesive, heat bonding and sutures to permanently attach porcelain doll masks to his victims' faces. The masks couldn't be removed without destroying what remained of the person underneath. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. Pig performed crude lobotomies, destroying the parts of the brain responsible for individual personality and will. He administered drug cocktails that erased memory and rewired neural pathways. By the time he finished, the victim was gone. What remained was a Dollotron, docile, obedient, empty. Pig called it art, called it perfection. He spoke about his Dollotrons the way a sculptor speaks about marble, as if he were revealing the true form hidden beneath the flawed exterior. He kept detailed journals documenting each transformation, complete with before and after photographs. The before photos showed terrified people, bound and gagged, eyes wide with the knowledge of what was about to happen. The after photos showed blank doll faces, heads tilted at identical angles, bodies positioned in poses of eerie uniformity. When Batman finally captured Professor Pig and discovered his workshop, 23 Dollotrons were found in various stages of completion. The GCPD was able to identify 19 of them from missing persons reports. 4 remained unknown. Their fingerprints didn't match any database. Their faces were gone. Their minds were gone. They were lost in the most complete way possible. Pig was declared criminally insane and sent to Arkham Asylum. He went willingly, almost cheerfully. During transport he hummed opera and spoke about how the asylum would appreciate his work, how the doctors there understood the pursuit of perfection even if they framed it differently. Batman found that statement disturbing but dismissed it as the rambling of a broken mind. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Dr. Ellen Vance, a psychiatrist who'd worked at Arkham for 3 years, was found unconscious in a supply closet. When paramedics removed her surgical mask, the one medical staff wore during certain procedures, they found it wasn't a mask at all. It was fused to her face. Ellen Vance was a Dollotron, had been a Dollotron for 3 months, and nobody had noticed. The revelation triggered an emergency investigation. Every staff member was examined. Every patient was re-evaluated. Batman personally reviewed intake photos and current appearances, looking for the subtle signs of Pig's handiwork. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. 7 patients weren't patients at all. They were Dollotrons that Pig had placed in Arkham before his capture. Sleeper agents of a sort, though they didn't commit violence or sabotage. They simply existed, moving through the asylum's routines, observing. Pig had been studying the facility through their eyes, learning its patterns, understanding its rhythms. He transformed them and sent them in as scouts. And in Ellen Vance's case, he'd done it while already imprisoned, which meant he'd had help, meant someone on staff had been compromised long before anyone suspected. The surgical examination of the Dollotrons revealed the horrifying extent of the transformation. The masks weren't just attached, they'd been integrated. The porcelain had somehow bonded with bone structure underneath, becoming part of the skull. The lobotomies weren't clean medical procedures. Pig had destroyed brain tissue with what appeared to be heated instruments, cauterizing as he went, creating scar tissue that had calcified over months. The drug cocktails had fundamentally altered brain chemistry in ways that might be permanent. Dr. Leslie Tompkins, one of the few medical professionals Batman trusted completely, examined the Dollotrons and delivered a verdict that haunted him. She said they might never recover. The damage was too extensive, too thorough. Even if they could surgically remove the masks, even if they could repair some of the brain damage, the person underneath was likely gone forever. The Dollotron was all that remained. Batman insisted on trying anyway. He brought in specialists, neurosurgeons, psychiatrists, experts in deprogramming and trauma recovery. They attempted restoration on 3 of the Dollotrons, the ones whose transformations were most recent and therefore potentially reversible. The surgeries took hours, the recovery took weeks, and when those 3 patients finally woke up after the masks were removed, after the drugs cleared from their systems, after every medical intervention had been exhausted, they weren't restored. They were worse. Without the mask, without the drugs, without the lobotomy's mercy, they were trapped in a nightmare state. aware enough to know they'd been violated but not aware enough to function. They screamed constantly, tore at their faces, begged to be made into Dollotrons again, because the blank emptiness was preferable to the half-consciousness they now inhabited. One of them was named David Reeves. Before Pig took him, David had been an architect, married, 2 children. His family visited him after the failed restoration. His wife held his hand while he sobbed and didn't recognize her. His children asked why Daddy looked so scared. The doctors had to sedate him just to keep him from hurting himself. His wife made a request that the ethics board denied, but that she kept repeating. She asked them to put the mask back on, to give him back the peace he'd had as a Dollotron. The other 4 Dollotrons were never restored. Medical professionals agreed that attempting it would be cruel. At least as Dollotrons, they felt nothing, experienced nothing, existed in a state that resembled peace, even if it wasn't truly peace. Taking that away, forcing them into awareness of what had been done to them, seemed like inflicting a new trauma, rather than healing an old one. Professor Pig watched these ethical debates from his cell. Guards reported that he smiled constantly during that period, seemed pleased. When Batman confronted him, demanding to know how he'd created Dollotrons from inside Arkham, how he'd compromised Dr. Vance, how he'd orchestrated something so complex while imprisoned, Pig gave an answer that connected to everything else Batman had discovered. He said the asylum taught him, showed him things he'd never imagined in his outside workshop. The building itself was a teacher, he claimed, whispering techniques and methods to those who knew how to listen. The Dollotrons weren't his crowning achievement. They were just practice, preparation for the true perfection he would create when he finally understood what Arkham was trying to tell him. Batman left that interview understanding that Arkham's influence went beyond collecting madness. It amplified it, refined it, took the broken impulses of damaged minds, and sharpened them into something worse. Pig had been a monster before Arkham, but the asylum had made him a more effective monster, more precise, more terrible. And if that was true for Pig, it was true for every dangerous mind housed within these walls. The Joker, the Scarecrow, Poison Ivy, Two-Face. Every villain Batman had fought and imprisoned here was potentially being upgraded, enhanced, perfected by whatever lived beneath the foundation. Arkham wasn't containing Gotham's threats, it was cultivating them. After the Dollotron crisis, Batman needed to confront something he'd been avoiding. The question of whether some prisoners were beyond redemption, whether some minds were so fundamentally broken that no environment, no matter how toxic or corrupting, could make them worse. That question led him to Victor Zsasz. Zsasz's cell was in the maximum security wing, behind reinforced doors and under constant surveillance. Batman had put him there personally after his last capture. Zsasz had killed 43 people in that spree, carving a tally mark into his own flesh for each victim. His body was covered in scars, hundreds of them, each one representing a life he'd taken. He called them his collection, his scoreboard, his proof that he understood something the rest of humanity refused to accept. The cell itself was unlike anything Batman had seen in Arkham. Every surface was covered in tallies, scratched into the concrete walls, carved into the metal bed frame, etched into the floor. Guards reported that Zsasz spent hours each day adding to them, using whatever he could find. His fingernails when they confiscated tools, his own blood when they gave him nothing else. The marks covered every square inch layered upon each other, creating a tapestry of lines that seemed to move in the dim light. Batman had reviewed Zsasz's file countless times. The psychological evaluations all reached similar conclusions: severe dissociative disorder, complete absence of empathy, delusional belief system centered on death as liberation. But reading about Zsasz and confronting him directly were vastly different experiences. When Batman entered the cell, Zsasz was sitting cross-legged on his bunk, perfectly still, eyes closed, meditating. He didn't acknowledge Batman's presence for several minutes. When he finally opened his eyes, his expression was serene, peaceful. He looked like a monk who'd achieved enlightenment, not a serial killer responsible for over 200 deaths. Zsasz spoke first, his voice calm and measured. You came to understand. Most people come to judge. But you're different. You've seen enough death to know there's no meaning in life. No purpose. Just biological processes running their course until they stop. I simply help people reach that inevitable conclusion sooner, with less suffering. Batman had heard this philosophy before. Nihilism wrapped in pseudo-intellectualism, but something about the way Zsasz presented it was more disturbing than typical criminal rationalization. He wasn't angry, wasn't bitter. He genuinely believed every word. Spoke about murder the way a doctor speaks about surgery, a necessary procedure, an act of mercy. Batman began investigating the tallies more closely. At first glance, they seemed random, chaotic scratches with no pattern or organization. But as he examined them with forensic attention, he noticed irregularities. Some marks were deeper than others. Some were oriented at specific angles. Some were grouped in clusters that didn't match victim counts from known murders. He photographed the walls and ran pattern recognition software. What emerged was extraordinary. The tallies formed a code, a complex system of communication that Zsasz had been using for years. Certain arrangements spelled out coordinates. Others formed names. Some contained detailed plans for escapes and future murders, all hidden in plain sight, because everyone assumed the marks were just the obsessive scratching of a madman. One pattern caught Batman's attention immediately. A cluster of tallies near the cell door that, when decoded, spelled out Alfred Pennyworth. Below it was a date. 3 weeks from now, and below that were coordinates that matched the location of Wayne Manor. Batman turned to Zsasz, asked him directly about the marked tallies. Zsasz smiled, genuinely pleased that someone had finally noticed his work. He explained that planning was part of the meditation, part of the philosophy. Death was inevitable, but the art was in choosing the moment, the method, the meaning. He'd been marking people for liberation for years while imprisoned, keeping a catalogue of future acts, maintaining his purpose even behind bars. The therapy sessions Zsasz attended were supposed to help him confront his violent ideation. Instead, they'd become recruitment opportunities. Dr. Patterson, the psychiatrist assigned to Zsasz's case, reported that he was one of the most engaged patients in the facility. He participated thoughtfully in group therapy. He offered support to other inmates. He seemed genuinely interested in their struggles and pain. What Dr. Patterson didn't realize was that Zsasz was converting them. Slowly, carefully. He identified vulnerable patients, ones whose mental illness left them susceptible to his particular brand of nihilism. He befriended them, listened to their suffering, then offered them his solution. Liberation through death, freedom from the burden of meaningless existence. 3 patients had fully adopted his philosophy. They'd stopped fighting their depression and suicidal ideation because Zsasz convinced them it was actually clarity. 4 others were showing early signs of conversion, speaking about death with the same calm acceptance Zsasz modeled. A cult was forming within Arkham, organized around the principle that killing and being killed were both acts of compassion in a universe devoid of purpose. Batman confronted Zsasz about this too, demanded to know why he was recruiting followers when his original philosophy seemed so solitary. Zsasz's answer revealed depths to his pathology that Batman hadn't anticipated. He said that loneliness was the one form of suffering he couldn't liberate people from, that he'd realized after years of killing alone that humanity's only real curse wasn't life itself, but the awareness of life's meaninglessness. So he was building a community of people who understood, who could face the void together, who could help each other achieve liberation when the time was right. It was a death cult, pure and simple, but Zsasz presented it as mutual aid, as enlightenment, as the only honest response to existential truth. And some patients, broken by their own darkness and Arkham's oppressive atmosphere, were accepting that framework. The philosophical debate that followed lasted hours. Batman argued for meaning, for purpose, for the value of human connection and achievement. Zsasz countered every point with calm logic. He asked Batman if he'd ever felt truly at peace. If the mission, the endless fight, the constant war against chaos ever brought lasting satisfaction. He suggested that Batman already understood the truth, but lacked the courage to accept it. What made the conversation so unsettling wasn't that Zsasz made good arguments. It was that he seemed content, genuinely at peace with his worldview in a way Batman had never achieved with his own. The Dark Knight fought every night to impose order on chaos, to find meaning in tragedy. Zsasz had simply accepted meaninglessness and found freedom in that acceptance. Batman left that cell with Alfred's name burned into his memory. Zsasz had marked someone close to him, had made it personal in a way that transcended typical villain threats. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point. Zsasz genuinely believed he'd be doing Alfred a favor by killing him. Believed he'd be liberating an old man from the burden of watching Bruce Wayne destroy himself night after night in a futile quest for justice. The question Batman couldn't answer, the one that followed him through Arkham's corridors as he continued his investigation, was whether engaging with Zsasz's philosophy had been a mistake, whether exposing himself to that particular strain of nihilism had planted seeds of doubt that would grow in quiet moments, whether understanding a monster's worldview meant risking infection by that worldview. Arkham had a way of making every visitor question themselves, every investigator doubt their certainties, and Victor Zsasz, with his calm voice and peaceful expression, had found the crack in Batman's armor, the fear that maybe, just maybe, the fight was meaningless after all. The deeper Batman went into Arkham's corruption, the more he realized he was looking at individual symptoms of a systemic disease: Calendar Man's predictions, Jane Doe's stolen memories, Mad Hatter's controlled staff, Professor Pig's hidden Dollotrons, Victor Zsasz's recruitment cult. Each case seemed isolated until Batman started mapping connections between them. Every thread led back to one prisoner who shouldn't have had any power at all: Warren White. Most people knew White's story as a cautionary tale about faking insanity. He'd been a financial criminal, a corrupt investor who defrauded thousands of people out of their life savings through elaborate Ponzi schemes. When federal prosecutors built an airtight case against him, White claimed mental incompetence, pretended to have a psychotic break, convinced a judge he belonged in psychiatric care rather than prison. The judge sent him to Arkham Asylum. White thought he'd beaten the system, thought a psychiatric facility would be easier than federal prison. He'd manipulate some therapists, fake recovery after a year or two, walk free. But Arkham had other plans for Warren White. On his third night in the asylum, there was a catastrophic systems failure. Temperature control went offline throughout the facility. Most wings experienced minor discomfort, but White had been placed in a cell in the sub-basement, a cell that had previously housed Mr. Freeze, and when the cooling systems failed, the residual cryogenic equipment in that cell activated. Warren White spent 18 hours in sub-zero temperatures before anyone realized what had happened. By the time they extracted him, the damage was irreversible. His skin had turned pale white from severe frostbite. His lips had blackened and peeled away, leaving his teeth permanently exposed in a skeletal grin. His nose and ears had suffered necrosis and had to be surgically removed. The cold had damaged nerve endings throughout his body, leaving him in constant pain. But the cold had done something else too. It had sharpened his mind, or maybe the trauma had simply stripped away the pretense of sanity he'd been performing. Whatever the reason, the man who emerged from that frozen cell was no longer pretending to be crazy. He'd become something worse: the Great White Shark, a predator who'd learned to thrive in Arkham's depths. Batman discovered White's empire through financial records. He'd started following money trails related to Arkham's operations and found irregularities everywhere: supplies ordered but never delivered, medication purchased at inflated prices from shell companies, construction contracts awarded to non-existent firms. Millions of dollars were bleeding out of the asylum's budget, and every fraudulent transaction connected back to accounts White controlled. But the financial corruption was just the foundation. White had systematically compromised every level of Arkham's administration. He'd identified which guards were struggling with debt and offered them extra income for small favors, which doctors had gambling problems or substance dependencies and needed someone to cover their tracks, which administrators had secrets they'd pay to keep hidden. Over 3 years, White built a network that rivaled any criminal organization operating outside Arkham's walls. From his cell, he orchestrated 23 major crimes, bank robberies coordinated through coded messages smuggled out by guards, contract killings arranged through contacts maintained by compromised doctors, blackmail schemes targeting Gotham's elite based on information gathered from patient files. The guards who'd worked for Mad Hatter, moving prisoners during shift changes, had actually been working for White. He'd been mapping the facility's security patterns. The staff members Professor Pig compromised had given White access to medical records and patient vulnerabilities. Even Victor Zsasz's recruitment cult served White's purposes by creating chaos that distracted from his operations. Batman realized with growing horror that nearly every case he'd investigated connected to White's network. The Great White Shark hadn't just adapted to Arkham, he'd conquered it, turned the asylum into his criminal empire's headquarters. And he'd done it while everyone dismissed him as a white-collar criminal out of his depth. The interview with Warren White was unlike any other Batman had conducted in Arkham. White sat across from him in the visiting room, his skeletal face incapable of expression, but his voice smooth and confident. He spoke about Arkham as if it were a business opportunity that others had been too short-sighted to exploit. He explained his philosophy without shame or deception. Arkham was Gotham's most valuable real estate for criminal enterprise. It housed the city's most dangerous minds under one roof. It attracted staff members who were already compromised by the stress of working there. It operated with minimal oversight, because politicians wanted to forget it existed. And most importantly, it was protected. Nobody investigated Arkham too closely because doing so meant confronting the reality that Gotham's criminal justice system was built on a foundation of managed insanity. White had recognized all of this within weeks of his arrival. While other prisoners raged against their confinement or succumbed to despair, he'd seen opportunity. He'd understood that Arkham operated according to different rules than the outside world, that the usual hierarchies didn't apply here. That someone smart enough and ruthless enough could build something extraordinary within these walls. Batman asked why White bothered. He'd already made millions through his schemes, could have set up accounts, planned an escape, disappeared into a comfortable exile. Why continue operating from inside Arkham when he could be free? White's answer revealed a disturbing evolution in his thinking. He said he'd tried planning escapes at first, had bribed guards, studied routes, prepared every detail, but every time he came close to leaving, something stopped him, a feeling he couldn't explain. A sense that walking away from Arkham would mean abandoning the only place he'd ever felt truly powerful. Outside he'd been just another corrupt businessman, smart, but unremarkable. Inside Arkham, he was a king, the architect of an empire that spanned both sides of the law. He'd found his calling in the last place anyone would look for it. And the building itself seemed to reward his ambitions, seemed to whisper opportunities and strategies when he needed them most. That statement made Batman's investigation suddenly cohere into a complete picture. Arkham wasn't just amplifying individual madness, it was organizing it, using prisoners like White to create structure, to build networks, to serve purposes that went beyond simple chaos. The asylum had turned the Great White Shark from a failed con artist into a criminal mastermind because it needed someone with his particular skills, needed an organizer, a facilitator, someone who could coordinate the activities of multiple dangerous minds towards some larger goal. Batman needed to understand that goal, needed to know what Arkham was building toward. The answer wouldn't come from interrogating prisoners or compromised staff, it would come from the source. From the sealed chambers beneath the foundation where Amadeus Arkham had written his final warnings on the walls. Before descending into those depths, Batman sought out Dr. Jeremiah Arkham, the current director and the last surviving member of the Arkham family bloodline. Jeremiah had always been cooperative but distant, treating Batman's investigations as necessary nuisances rather than serious concerns. Now Batman needed him to break that professional detachment and speak about the family curse he'd mentioned years ago. They met in Jeremiah's office at midnight. The director looked exhausted, older than his years, haunted by something he'd been carrying alone for too long. Batman asked him directly about what Amadeus had discovered, about why the family had sealed those chambers, about what really lived beneath Arkham Asylum. Jeremiah poured himself a drink and told Batman something that changed everything. The Arkham family had made a bargain generations ago, long before Amadeus built the asylum, before the manor house, before European settlement. His ancestors had discovered something buried in the land, something ancient and hungry. They'd tried to destroy it and failed, so they'd made a deal instead. They would contain it, feed it, keep it satisfied with a steady diet of human suffering so it wouldn't spread beyond the estate. Every generation of Arkhams had maintained that bargain, had gone mad from the burden of it, and Amadeus had tried to end it by building the asylum, by creating a structure that would trap the entity permanently. But he'd only made it stronger, given it a body, a way to touch more minds, consume more suffering, grow more powerful. Jeremiah looked at Batman with eyes that held generations of guilt and said the thing that explained everything. The asylum can never be destroyed because destroying it would release what it contains, and what it contains would consume Gotham in days. Maybe the world, we're not running a hospital, we're maintaining a prison for something that predates humanity. And every patient, every staff member, every person who suffers here is a sacrifice we make to keep that thing contained. Batman finally understood. Arkham Asylum was necessary. Not despite its horrors but because of them. The suffering was the point, the price paid for Gotham's survival, and now he had to decide whether to continue that terrible bargain or find another way. Batman's investigation had revealed how Arkham corrupted prisoners and staff alike, but there was one transformation he'd never fully understood, one case that seemed too personal, too complete to be explained by simple manipulation or environmental toxicity. Dr. Harleen Quinzel's metamorphosis into Harlequin had always bothered him because it represented something terrifying, proof that even the helpers, the ones who came to heal, could be destroyed by what lived within these walls. He found her private journals in the staff archives, sealed in a box marked with her employee number. Nobody had read them since her transformation. Nobody wanted to confront what they might reveal about their own vulnerability. Batman opened the first journal and began reading the account of a brilliant mind's systematic destruction. Dr. Harleen Quinzel arrived at Arkham fresh from graduate school, armed with degrees from prestigious universities and burning with idealism. She specialized in criminal psychology and genuinely believed she could reach even the most damaged minds. Her intake evaluation described her as confident, empathetic, and resilient, the perfect candidate for Arkham's challenging environment. She requested assignment to the facility's most difficult patient, the Joker. Her supervisors warned her against it, but Harleen insisted. She'd written her dissertation on psychopathic personality disorders and believed she understood the Joker's pathology better than the senior psychiatrists who'd failed to treat him. She was 26 years old and convinced she could succeed where others had failed. The first session was unremarkable. The Joker performed his usual routine, jokes and riddles, deflection and misdirection. Harleen noted that he was testing her, trying to find her boundaries and weaknesses. She felt confident she could maintain professional distance. The journal entry from that day was clinical and optimistic. But Batman could see what Harleen couldn't at the time. The Joker had been studying her from that very first moment, not testing her professional boundaries, but mapping her psychological landscape. Every question he asked, every joke he made, was designed to gather information about who Harleen Quinzel really was beneath her professional persona. Over 18 months, the sessions continued twice weekly. Harleen's journals documented what she thought was progress. The Joker began speaking more openly, sharing details about his childhood, his traumas, his pain. He cried during some sessions, laughed during others, showed vulnerability that no other doctor had witnessed. Harleen believed she was reaching him, helping him process decades of unresolved trauma. What she didn't realize was that every detail the Joker shared was calculated. He'd researched her background before she ever walked into his cell. He knew about her father's abandonment when she was 12, her mother's depression, her brother's drug addiction, her own struggles with feeling responsible for fixing broken people. He'd studied her published papers, her academic arguments, her theoretical frameworks, and he'd crafted a persona specifically designed to match her therapeutic approach. The journals showed the gradual shift. Around month 6, Harleen started writing about the Joker differently, less clinical observation, more personal reflection. She described feeling a connection with him, understanding him in ways other doctors couldn't. She wrote about how his pain mirrored her own childhood wounds, how his humor was a defense mechanism she recognized from her own family dynamics. By month 12, the boundaries had completely eroded. She was staying late for extra sessions, bringing him small gifts she rationalized as therapeutic tools, defending him to other staff members who questioned her judgment. The journals from this period showed someone desperately trying to justify decisions she knew were inappropriate but couldn't stop making. Then came session 127, the breaking point. Harleen arrived for their regular appointment, expecting another breakthrough. Instead, the Joker looked at her with complete clarity and said something that shattered her entire worldview. He told her he'd been sane the entire time. Every tear, every trauma story, every moment of vulnerability had been performance. He'd never been mentally ill in any clinical sense. He was simply someone who'd chosen chaos over order, madness over sanity, because he found it more honest, more true to the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. Harleen's journal entry from that night was barely legible. She'd written and crossed out multiple attempts to process what had happened. The realization that 18 months of therapy had been 18 months of manipulation, that every breakthrough was staged, every moment of connection was calculated, that she hadn't been healing him because there was nothing to heal. But worse than the professional failure was the personal devastation. She'd fallen in love with a fiction, had rebuilt her entire identity around being the one person who could reach the unreachable patient, and that identity had been nothing but a reflection of what the Joker wanted her to see. She was Jane Doe in reverse. She hadn't stolen someone's identity. Someone had constructed an identity for her, and she'd accepted it completely. The journal entries after session 127 showed a woman coming apart. She questioned everything. If the Joker could choose madness, could choose to reject society's definitions of sanity and morality, then what did that say about the arbitrary nature of mental health treatment, about the power dynamics between doctor and patient, about the fundamental assumptions underlying her entire career? She wrote about how the world suddenly seemed like a stage where everyone was performing sanity rather than actually being sane. How the Joker's honesty about his performance made him more authentic than the doctors who pretended their own masks were their true faces. How maybe madness wasn't a disease but a response, a choice, a liberation from the exhausting pretense of normalcy. Her handwriting changed over those weeks, became looser, more erratic. She started drawing in the margins, smiling faces that looked slightly wrong, questions written and rewritten. The transformation was visible in the physical evidence of her deteriorating grip on the identity she'd built. The final entry before she helped the Joker escape was a single sentence. If he's crazy for choosing chaos, what am I for choosing order in a world that makes no sense? Batman closed the journal and sat in the darkness of the archives. He understood now why Harleen Quinzel's transformation haunted him, Because it showed that Arkham didn't just corrupt through toxins or whispers, it corrupted through truth. Through forcing people to confront questions they couldn't answer. Through revealing that the line between sanity and madness was thinner and more arbitrary than anyone wanted to believe. He thought about his own choices, about becoming Batman, about the mask he wore and whether Bruce Wayne or the Dark Knight was the performance, about whether fighting for order in a chaotic world was noble or simply another form of madness that society happened to approve of. The asylum had a way of making everyone question themselves. And sometimes, Batman realized, those questions didn't have good answers. Sometimes, the only choice was between comfortable lies and devastating truths. Harleen Quinzel had chosen truth and been destroyed by it. Batman had to decide whether pursuing the truth about Arkham was worth the same risk. He stood and walked toward the sealed chambers in the sub-basement, toward the final revelation, toward the truth that Amadeus Arkham had tried to warn about, but couldn't quite bring himself to destroy. Whatever waited there would either validate his quest for answers, or prove that some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. The time for investigation was over. Now came the confrontation with what lived beneath Arkham Asylum. The entrance to the sealed chambers lay behind a wall in the sub-basement that had been plastered over in 1921. Batman used specialized equipment to locate the hollow space Amadeus Arkham had tried to hide. The wall came down easily, revealing a doorway that had been bricked up with materials that predated the asylum itself. Beyond the doorway was a staircase descending into absolute darkness. The air tasted ancient here, thick with awareness. Batman counted 143 steps before reaching the bottom, deeper than should be possible given the building's known structure. The chamber at the bottom was circular, its walls covered in writing, scratched with fingernails and bone fragments. Multiple languages layered over each other, Lenape, English, Latin, and beneath all the written words were symbols that seemed to writhe in his flashlight beam, suggesting something between language and living tissue. Batman read the walls, translating what he could, piecing together the narrative Amadeus Arkham had left behind. The entity had existed in this location for thousands of years. The Lenape people had called it the collector of broken spirits, something older than humanity that fed on existential anguish, on the specific suffering that came when minds confronted truths they couldn't integrate. The Arkham family had discovered it in 1687 and made a terrible bargain. Feed it regularly, or watch it spread across the region. Every generation of Arkhams had maintained that deal, sacrificing their own sanity to protect everyone else. Amadeus thought he'd found a better solution. Build an institution that naturally concentrated suffering. Let society's most broken minds provide endless sustenance. But the entity had whispered to him, taught him architecture that would amplify madness, showed him how to design a building that would become its body. The asylum wasn't built on cursed ground. It was built as physical form for something that had never had one. Every corridor was a neural pathway. Every cell was a sensory organ. The building itself was alive, channeling and concentrating psychological energy. Batman found Amadeus's final message carved at shoulder height. It showed me the truth. Every prisoner who suffers here feeds its strength. Calendar Man hears it counting futures. Jane Doe hears it sharing stolen memories. The Hatter hears it teaching control. I thought I was building a hospital. I was building a god of madness. And now I must become part of its structure. A cornerstone of suffering that holds everything else in place. The realization hit Batman with devastating force. Every case he'd investigated connected, because they were all expressions of the same entity. The asylum was conducting individual madness like instruments in a symphony. Calendar Man's predictions worked because the entity existed outside linear time. Jane Doe accessed its archive of stolen identities. Mad Hatter learned from its centuries of psychological manipulation. Professor Pig received surgical knowledge to create more vessels. Victor Zsasz spread its nihilistic philosophy. Warren White organized it all into coherent structure. And Harlequin's transformation demonstrated the entity's ultimate goal. It wanted to prove that sanity itself was arbitrary, that choosing chaos wasn't insanity but awakening. The entity had grown powerful enough to touch people beyond Arkham's walls. Its influence spread through Gotham like roots through soil, and destroying the asylum wouldn't stop it anymore. The entity existed in the collective consciousness of everyone who'd walked these halls. Demolishing the building would release it completely. Batman climbed the stairs back toward the asylum above, carrying knowledge too heavy for one person, but too dangerous to share. He understood now why Arkham persisted, why every reform failed, because it had to. Because Arkham Asylum was Gotham's sacrifice, the terrible bargain that kept something worse from consuming everything. He emerged into the sub-basement and sealed the entrance behind him. Some truths needed to remain buried. He would tell no one what he'd discovered. Not Alfred, not Commissioner Gordon, not even the Justice League. This burden was his alone to carry. But understanding changed his mission. Batman returned to the administrative offices and began implementing new protocols, not to close Arkham, but to improve it within the constraints of its true purpose. Better staff support systems, mandatory rotations to prevent prolonged exposure, enhanced security that protected both prisoners and guards, improved living conditions that reduced suffering without eliminating the containment function. He worked with Dr. Jeremiah Arkham to establish oversight that the entity couldn't easily corrupt. External review boards, surprise inspections, whistleblower protections. They couldn't eliminate the darkness, but they could limit its worst excesses. Batman visited each case subject one final time. Calendar Man in his cell covered with coded tallies, Jane Doe staring at her shattered mirrors, Victor Zsasz meditating among his marks. He saw them differently now, not just criminals to contain but necessary sacrifices in a war most people didn't know was being fought. He stood outside Professor Pig's cell and watched the monster hum opera while sketching designs for new Dollotrons, stood outside Warren White's cell and saw the great white shark coordinating his empire through coded messages. Each of them was a piece of something larger. Each of them served purposes they didn't fully understand. And perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps not knowing was the kindness the entity offered in exchange for their service. Batman left Arkham Asylum as dawn broke over Gotham Harbor. The building looked different in morning light, less threatening, almost beautiful in its gothic grandeur. Mist rolled off the water and wrapped around its towers like a shroud. Somewhere inside, patients were waking to another day of treatment that would never truly heal them. Staff were beginning shifts that would slowly erode their sanity. The cycle continued because it had to continue. He stood on the grounds and watched the sun rise over the city. Gotham awakened below him. Millions of people starting their days, unaware of the sacrifice made on their behalf, unaware that their sanity was protected by the concentrated madness of Arkham's prisoners, that their ability to function, to hope, to believe in meaning and order was purchased with the suffering of people society had already discarded. Batman had always believed in absolute justice, in saving everyone, in never giving up on any life, but Arkham taught him that some evils couldn't be punched away, some darkness served necessary purposes, some prisons protected the innocent by containing something far worse than the criminals they housed. He thought about Amadeus Arkham's choice, to build the asylum knowing what it would become, to sacrifice his own sanity to maintain the seal, to accept that helping one group meant sacrificing another. It was the kind of choice Batman had always refused to make. The trolley problem he'd sworn to transcend by finding the third option that saved everyone. But there was no third option here, only the terrible arithmetic of necessary evil, only the understanding that protection sometimes required sacrifice, that some heroes bore the weight of truth alone. Alfred was waiting when Batman returned to the cave. He took one look at Bruce's face, and knew not to ask questions, simply handed him tea, and stayed present in the silence. Some burdens couldn't be shared, but they could be witnessed. Batman spent the following weeks adjusting to his new reality, still fighting crime, still protecting Gotham, but carrying knowledge that colored everything. When he captured the Joker after another rampage, he delivered him to Arkham, knowing exactly what that meant. Knowing he was feeding the entity, knowing that the Joker's madness would be harvested and concentrated and used to keep something worse at bay. The Joker laughed all the way to his cell, as if he knew the joke Batman had finally understood, that they were all players in a game with rules written by something older than civilization, that chaos and order weren't opposites but partners in a dance that kept reality stable. Gotham settled into its familiar rhythms, crime and punishment, madness and containment, the eternal cycle that defined the city. And high on the cliff overlooking the harbor, Arkham Asylum stood watch. A lighthouse warning ships away from dangerous shores, a prison holding darkness at bay, a sacrifice offered nightly to keep the dawn coming. Batman watched from the rooftops, as lights flickered on in Arkham's windows, night shift beginning, patients settling into their routines. The building breathed and whispered and fed, and Gotham slept, protected by nightmares contained within stone walls. Some secrets kept people safe, some prisons protected the innocent, and some heroes bore the weight of truth alone, standing between comfortable ignorance and devastating knowledge, choosing each night to maintain the terrible bargain that allowed hope to survive in a city built on darkness. The mist rolled in from the harbor, wrapping Gotham in soft gray silence, and in that silence, Batman kept his vigil, guardian of a city that would never know the true price of its survival.